You should have all gotten a message. And I will pass the mic on to Alfred Nordman, who is going to lead this webinar, introduce himself and our other speakers.
Well, thank you very much, Beatrice. I'm glad to be part of this webinar. This is my first webinar, actually, in my whole life, I must confess, which is a kind of confession also about my age and my generation. At the same time, I'm really looking forward to this format to discuss something with all of you that I find is becoming increasingly important, even though when we planned this webinar, there was no talk yet about a war going on in Europe or about the invasion of the Ukraine. So we were thinking about this topic, citizen science for peace, and also tinkering for peace, a long time and independently of the current conflict. But of course, it is becoming all the more important in light of the current conflict. So I think. And it's a question that we want to pursue, which is very open-ended, and we have to look at, in some sense, the very basic question of what we can do. I mean, what we can do in any situation, at any time of history. What can citizen science, what can tinkerers and maker spaces contribute to the creation of a peaceful world? And whatever that means, we have to talk maybe also about that. This is not unconnected. So, but before I say anything more about the general sort of topic, I want to quickly introduce myself, and then we were thinking of introducing ourselves, the three main people today, even though everyone is a main person, but the three main speakers, the announced speakers, and let's see how Daphne is faring. If she's not there in time, I'll maybe try to introduce her. And in the meantime, so my name is Alfred Nordman. I'm actually at this point in my life still a professor of philosophy, but this is not actually the role in which I am here. I've been very much interested always in the question about how science and technology incorporate values, and how the creation of technology and also the creation of scientific knowledge always reflects a kind of orientation towards certain kind of basic values. And so at the University of Darmstadt, we've been also working for a long time already on the question of what we called naturwissenschaftliche Friedensforschung, a kind of peace research from a natural science point of view. But however, this kind of effort has in some sense faded a little bit, at least at German universities. Fortunately, there are some very powerful centers still in the world where this kind of research is going on. But it has sort of been backgrounded a little bit. And so I felt that we have to change, in some sense, the venue. And maybe it's even appropriate to say that it is moving away from academia and into civil society. And that is actually the point of view from which I want to talk to you today, and why I had this initiative to propose this webinar. Because we've been trying to work at the Janus Peace Lab, and Janus you spell I-A-N-U-S. Maybe we'll put this in the chat. I'll maybe put you a website in the chat in a moment. So the Janus Peace Lab is actually a lab at a makerspace in Darmstadt, and it's a bit of a program. It's a bit of an idea, and what we're trying to do is inject the notion of peace-oriented work into the maker scene, into the kind of work that people do in maker spaces, and so on. And of course, it also concerns citizen science more broadly. And this attempt also, of course, then raises the question: how do we do this? Well, thank you very much. Daughter has already posted a link. Thank you very much. And so we will see. I mean, of course, it raises a big question about what it is precisely that a Janus Peace Lab can effect, not only in Darmstadt, maybe, but beyond. And that's what we're working on. And I'm always hoping to gather good ideas and kind of to raise a little bit a kind of level of energy for this. So this is what I'm doing. And maybe Sarah, you want to introduce yourself next?
Thanks, Alfred. So hi everyone, I'm Sara Al-Sayed, glad to be here. I'm a postdoctoral research associate with the program on science and global security at Princeton University. My background though is in electrical engineering. That's where I also did my PhD at TU Darmstadt. And after my PhD, I picked up the master's program Technik und Philosophie on the philosophy of technology at TU Darmstadt. And I am still working on my master's thesis. But my line of research at Princeton University is the degree to which citizen scientists can contribute meaningfully to verification work, the verification of treaties in the context of either nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear arms control, or nuclear disarmament. Glad to be here. Yeah, thank you.
So maybe let's try, Daphne, we see you are back. So let's hope that maybe you can speak to us now. Let's try. Daphne, can you hear us? Yeah, maybe it's working now. Try. Well, she's shaking her head. So it doesn't look too good. So Sara is sending a message to Daphne. Maybe you can read the chat. In the meantime, I will just try, Daphne, to say a few words about you, and we still hope that you can join us, and you will introduce yourself then briefly. Daphne is a researcher in Montreal, and she's been working for many years, as I know her, also on questions of you might call it citizen science, broadly speaking, especially in the area of also biology. She has been interested in biohacking communities, but as a sociologist and also politically minded person, she's been looking also at the question about values regarding global justice, environmental justice, and so on, and how they tie in with the, let's say, biohacking communities and other people working in maker spaces for questions of biological diversity, synthetic biology, and so forth. So that is maybe just a few words about what she does. Maybe I didn't capture it very well. But in the meantime, let me begin with my quick opening statement, and then we'll turn over to Daphne, I hope, and then Sara. So my concern is mostly to ask really, what is the connection really between the question of peace and the question of technology development, and especially also the questions just simply of tinkering and also of monitoring and data collection for the purposes of kind of communal life, for the kind of forms of cooperation that we have in our civil societies. And so the first question is, of course, what is peace, right? So what is peace? And even though I'm a philosopher, don't expect me to answer that question in any kind of definitive way. But as we are already looking at also the current situation, we know it's more, and it will be more also in the case of the Ukraine, than just the weapons being stopped and in some sense the military activities to stop. Peace is obviously much more and requires much more than the absence of war in the sense of explicit military warfare. Peace obviously has something to do with conditions of trust, of respect, and in some sense you might say with ways of working together also in the presence of conflicts. You can't deny conflict, but in the presence of conflict, or you have to maybe find ways to work through those conflicts together, but not just by talking about your conflicts and about the sources of your disagreements, but also by doing. In other words, by joining in collaborative projects, for example. And I think this is perhaps a very powerful way to create conditions of peace. So you try to make things kind of work together in a way that doesn't require violence, that doesn't force things, but creatively produces what I sometimes call in a playful way a kind of happy or felicitous coordination, composition, work kind of working of things together. So, and of course you have that in technical devices. I mean, technical devices are, I think, intrinsically kind of peaceful things. Of course, not every technical device is made for peaceful purposes. We know that, and actually Sarah can tell us a lot about that. But so we have nuclear bombs and all kinds of other terrible things. But the basic idea of making something function and putting things together so that they can work together and in a kind of effective way is, I think, initially, in principle, a kind of peaceful activity. I mean, this is a very, very naive idea, maybe not enough for our discussion, and it's not much to build on. But I think it's a good starting point, because anyone who tinkers, and I'm not the best example, I'm not much of a tinkerer myself, but anyone who even kind of assembles an IKEA shelf, let's say, that you get from the department store and that you have to put together at home, kind of knows that you can't force things, right? That you have to assemble them in such a way that they kind of fit together kind of easily. Because anytime you exert force, you kind of force a screw to go in at some kind of place, you're already creating a future kind of problem. Something will crack sooner or later, and there'll be tension in the system, and of course friction and tension. Those are words that we know from technological devices, and which are a signal for us also in our social relationships that things go wrong, right? So we want things to kind of work together in such a way that we can minimize friction and work through the tensions, and in some sense create a kind of easy way in which the pieces, the elements, of course, humans and things and so forth, come together. Now, this again is a very simple and very naive notion, but it's maybe this kind of romantic ideal that motivates me, and to make it even more romantic, I will tell a kind of story of what I have in mind first when we talk about citizen science or tinkering for peace. What I have in mind first are those people who used to, especially in the late 20th century, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, but also even before and after, and even today, of course, who used to be what they call ham radio operators. So these were people who were sitting basically in their basements, and so they were often isolated people, and you wouldn't think that they were very good at creating peaceful, harmonious relationships. So in a sense, they were loners, perhaps, sitting in their basements with headphones on, like some of us right now, with headphones on. And what they were doing was also something like what we are doing now, but much more intently and much more deliberately, was kind of trying to listen into the vastness of space and into the world, right? So even when I grew up as a child, my radio had not just also had a kind of long wave channels, and I could hear sort of crackling sounds from extremely far away, you know. So I heard Budapest and Moscow and Kiev and so forth, and maybe even when, on a lucky day, you could hear sort of radio waves all the way from the very far east. So you had this kind of exotic, almost experience of being connected, of listening in with many sort of getting into a kind of relationship, perhaps also with things that were happening very, very far away in strange languages at remote places. And of course, if you were a serious ham radio operator, you didn't stop there just kind of listening, but you were trying to analyze to some extent where the signals were coming from. People were perhaps able to help out in emergency situations when there was maybe some emergency on a boat somewhere that was threatening to sink. And they were perhaps also quite able to help, as some people do now, to translate messages, help perhaps understand each other quite literally in a better way. And this was, of course, way before the internet made everything available to us. But for an analog activity right now, I would say there are people now who are just as amateur scientists and tinkerers and activists, indeed translating texts from newspapers, from social media sites, to facilitate somehow the kind of communication that is broken off in times of war, communication between Russia and Ukraine, between Europe and Ukraine, and between Europe and Russia, and so forth, and all these kinds of communications that are in resonance with each other, and we have to kind of become aware of this, make it present to us in some ways. And I think this is ultimately a kind of peaceful activity. I mean, it's very, very rudimentary, and it doesn't yet do much by way of actually bringing people together and making them cooperate. And we have maybe also an imagination for that. But the reason why I'm telling these stories is primarily because for me, the question about tinkering for peace has this very, very simple beginnings. And it's not something terribly elaborate. You don't have to have a formula to save the world, right? We don't have to first have a theoretical description of what goes wrong and how we can heal it. But we, in some sense, just enter in with the means that we have. But then to make that kind of fruitful and to give that a kind of voice, that would be the project that we're looking at. So this is, in some sense, already my little statement, and I'm still not sure whether Daphne has managed to reconnect with us. I think she's probably still trying to work on this. So Daphne, if you're not there, maybe I should turn over the word to Sara, and Sara, why don't, or maybe Daphne is back. Let's see. I see her just right now on the screen, so maybe something is working, but she's not looking very optimistic right now. No, I think she's still looking a bit puzzled. So why don't we just say, Sara and Daphne, please relax. If you can hear us, we'll work something out. We'll find a way to give you a voice here. Otherwise, Sara, why don't you then take over and
Thank you, Alfred. So I'd like to focus in my short prepared remarks on the role information and communication technologies, or ICTs for short, can play to promote peace. And by ICTs, I refer very broadly to technologies, but also technical skills and capabilities that run the gamut from the internet, by which I refer not only to its mundane connectivity functionality, but also its search engines, social media platforms, online fora, collaborative platforms, and online maps. But also technologies like, well, mobile telephony, the technical skill of crowd mapping, but then more broadly, crowdsourcing, and geo or chronolocation of imagery and video available on the internet, free and commercial satellite technology and imagery, and then finally, data and network analysis tools. By data analysis tools, I mean maybe those that serve to perform sentiment analysis. By network analysis tools, maybe you could think of community detection. Now, I believe that many citizen science or tinkering for peace initiatives, past and present, have taken the form of digital vigilantism. And the way I like to think about it is to have those projects fall into three classes. With respect to their orientation to state interests. So there are the citizen science projects that whose objective is to fill a gap that is inadequately addressed by the state. There are also the citizen science projects that engage in contentious politics, speaking truth to power, so to say. But then there is also the third category of projects, citizen science projects that serve to legitimate some state policies. Now, those classes are not mutually exclusive, nor are they exhaustive. Now, citizen science or tinkering for peace projects, past and present, have tended to address certain issue areas such as crime, political violence, election malpractices, human rights violations, war crimes, humanitarian crises, immigrant settlement, natural disasters, environmental calamities, and infectious disease outbreaks. and those issue areas contribute in their own way, some more, some less, to peace. Now, I'd like to take stock of some citizen science or tinkering for peace projects, past and present. Many have taken the form of crowd mapping. So those are crowd mapping projects. Popular in those was free and open source platform developed in 2007 in Kenya, in the wake of the Kenyan presidential elections and ensuing violence. The platform is called Ushahidi, and this is a Swahili word for witness or testimony. And the objective of this platform was to encourage those affected by political violence to post via SMS or through an online form the time, the location, the description of incidents of political violence, after which those incidents then would be pinpointed on a Google map. So the debut of this platform was, as I said, in 2007 Kenyan elections, but then it was also deployed in 2010 Haitian earthquake, and also in Egypt in 2010 with the project Harass Map that was supposed to map incidents of sexual harassment against women, which happens to be rampant in Egypt at the moment. It has been the case for a couple of decades now. Ushahidi platform for crowd mapping was also used in the context of the Syrian civil war and also in the US elections of the last decade. But a similar crowd mapping project was enabled also by the SafeCast platform deployed in Japan post the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. And this platform equipped the citizens with radiation and air quality sensors with which they would go around and try to record air quality levels and nuclear radiation fallout levels. And then those data points would be crowdsourced onto an online map. And this was basically an incident of the citizens trying to bring awareness to the fact that their own government was not transparent regarding the publication of data on the impact and the amount really of radiation post Fukushima. Another citizen science initiative was a do-it-yourself aerial mapping project that's used cameras that were tethered from balloons or kites, and that was deployed in contested territories in Israel. And the objective was community building and the promotion of agency among Palestinians, and the documentation and visualization of their lived experience of segregation, discrimination, surveillance, and the constant Israeli military presence. Another objective was to advance or attempt to advance territorial claims. A novelty about this project was to counter the dominance over the aerial perspective and the ensuing narratives, either by the occupying forces or by professional human rights organizations. The narratives of the latter two are basically consolidated through advanced inaccessible surveillance technology, in contrast to the simplicity of the camera and balloon kite setup employed in this do-it-yourself aerial mapping project. Now, if we substitute these simple cameras, balloons, and kites with more complex remote sensing technology, we get so-called geographic information systems. And those have been deployed over the last decade to preempt conflicts rather than just contain, resolve, or manage them. So not just for peacekeeping. And this is in the context of land and resource disputes. So those would be those geographic information systems would be deployed in order to map out locations where land and resource disputes are likely to emerge, and this then would inform policy making for early intervention before the conflicts erupt. Another project on the nuclear front is Nukewatch in the UK, and the objective of that project is the monitoring of warhead convoys on UK roads to detect and track the motion of convoys transporting nuclear warheads from the locations of their manufacture to locations of storage, within the UK, and the objective here is to amass evidence of the UK's increasing its nuclear stockpile, which is in deviation from its long-held policy to keep the arsenal size constant. Now, another that takes the form of vigilantism, in my point of view, is so-called societal verification, which is my line of research, and that's where citizens, or maybe more broadly, non-governmental organizations, so here the line is blurred a bit between citizens and citizen scientists and professional communities, those scour open sources for evidence of violations of treaties in the nuclear non-proliferation or arms control context. And then finally, and pertinent to our current state of affairs with the Russia-Ukraine war, you have citizens, but also chided on by non-governmental organizations like Bellingcat, like the Center for Information Resilience. Citizens here are being encouraged to document through open sources the atrocities committed by the Russian forces, amassing evidence for potential use in court, like the International Criminal Court. Now, of course, this would be a novelty for the ICC to incorporate this kind of evidence in its processes. But lo and behold, Bellingcat founder Elliot Higgins actually sits on the technical advisory board of the ICC, making sure to adapt the processes for the accommodation of such kind of evidence. And then finally, also in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, you have one non-governmental organization working to collect evidence from open sources, such as commercial and free satellite imagery of the nuclear-tipped submarines on the Russian side, in order to monitor signals of an imminent nuclear attack. And the objective here is to try to counter fear-mongering rhetoric about the intentions of Putin to deploy nuclear forces to attack Ukraine or the West. Now, having taken stock of some of these citizen science Tinkering for Peace projects past and present, what comes into view is the diversity of the actors, their interests, and the values embodied as well in their work. I'd be very happy to expound on these later, but then in the interest of time, I'd like to mention some of the challenges. There are the epistemological, not the least related to issues of uncertainty in the data, its authenticity, verifiability, and reliability, and how it holds up to different standards of certainty for different contexts. But then there are also the ethical challenges where those practices notably impact, have a bearing on various goods. There's the good of individual privacy, there's the good of individual group and public safety, and all this in the face of attempting to uphold third-party interests, not the least technology owners and managers, or upholding diplomatic norms for tension resolution, and upholding national security. But then let me now call to mind the three categories or classes of citizen science initiatives that I laid out at the outset. And that is how those citizen science initiatives, what is the nature of their orientation with respect to state interests? Because I believe that this has a bearing on the question of emancipation, the extent to which those initiatives are truly emancipatory and contributing to everlasting peace. So those categories were citizen science initiatives that fill a gap inadequately addressed by the state, citizen science engaging in contentious politics, speaking truth to power, and then finally citizen science serving a legitimating function for state policies. Now, regarding the latter category, I believe that when it manifests itself more prominently when one considers how some of these initiatives are being undertaken by a privileged few, privileged with respect to their access to the technologies in question, with respect to the kind of moral and material backing by of their institutions by their respective governments, and also privileged with respect to the kind of structures that they operate within, while being mindful, of course, of the fact that corporate power here is prevalent. Corporate power here features in backing many of the technologies that power many of these citizen science initiatives. So I'd like to leave you with a quote that captures, in my opinion, very prominently this third category of citizen science initiatives serving to legitimate, in this case, hegemonic Western state policies. This quote stems from Sheldon Himelfarb. He is the CEO and president of PeaceTech Labs in the US, which, among other things, is a PeaceTech movement accelerator. An example project that was under the patronage of and support of this accelerator was a Syrian missile attack early warning system. Now the quote goes, "Most conflict today is about local drivers, inter-ethnic and inter-religious tensions, gender violence, and land disputes. It's a matter of minority rights, corruption, authoritarian regimes. It's addressing these drivers which allow you to have a lasting peace and not lapse back into violence again." Now, I hope you agree with me that this quote represents a gross incompleteness, if not misrepresentation, of the true drivers of conflict, and it chimes, in my opinion, pretty well with the oft-repeated assertion that peace has prevailed in the West for the last 75 years, which, if you agree with me, obscures volumes. Yeah, thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very, very much. This was totally interesting, and it presented lots of different initiatives that I had no idea about, and I think we'll have a good discussion of that. But and of course, we all are relying on our other participants, the ones who can contribute only in the chat, to also submit questions. But maybe to complete the picture, it does look like Daphne is ready to go. And so Daphne, it's your turn, and then we have everything on the table, and then we can see how we make sense of all the different things that we put out.
So just testing. Do you hear me well? Yes. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My apologies for these technological issues. I had never had this one. I would like to thank you for having me. I would like to thank everyone involved in the organization of this event, Alfred Nordman included, and also thank him for the kind invitation. So a short word about me. I could not hear anything in the beginning. So I'm a sociologist working on sociology of science. Right now I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Ottawa in Canada. I have worked on nanotechnologies, and in my PhD, I worked on do-it-yourself bio, so all the biohacking community, synthetic biology, and they're trying to seize that democratic model. So how do they conceive democracy of biotechnology? And today I'm gonna, so it's, thank you, Sara, for this amazing and fascinating portrait, panoramic view of these groups and these activities. And I think it shows well in the beginning all the diversity of views and of perceptions and interests that these groups can have. And this is precisely what I would speak about today. So it's a more an abstract, a more theoretical contribution to the discussion on worldviews and how the importance of considering these when we work and we are attached to values such as peace and working in community, yeah, and all the challenge that this bears. So worldviews, the main topic for social science and humanities, yeah, it gives access for us to all what we can call the symbolic matter of our actions, of our practice, and that loads our actions with purpose and with meanings. It can be defined very briefly as a set of core values, of representations, of affects, of beliefs that will form a more or less consistent, even though always evolving matrix that shapes how we engage with reality in our everyday life. And worldviews are gonna shape our activities, our practice, but not determine them. And that's pretty essential, in understanding worldviews and also these actions when we work collectively. Because when we act, we are of course informed by our values, our intentions, our beliefs, but we cannot act completely following these symbolic attachments. Our actions are also conditioned by a whole broad of material and non-material, institutional, legal devices, if you want. And these are also gonna shape our activities. And so this speaks to all the challenge we have when we want to work for peace, in this case today, and the conditions, material or legal, institutional, we need to develop also. And I think Sara could speak a lot about that, how we can develop these conditions, material in tinkering, And the other thing that is that I would like to bring up, it's how the question of worldviews, it's active in very different levels. So on the level of the personal level, the individual, but also the collective level, and today more and more the global planetary level. So, and from the social science perspective also, another point essential in the question of worldviews, it's beyond its symbolic matter, is also that it can be considered as having a world-making power. So that's how we can contribute to changing worlds and systems that we don't agree with it. So it's also, we also draw on our values and beliefs. And to give more of more related to peace, so this question of worldviews has also been informing some research involved in peace and war questions. So, and how to the extent that how we as citizens, we position ourselves in security related policy issues, and so how we think, how we feel, how we act and we interact in our everyday life also impact how we will react and behave, so individually and socially, collectively, in the war conflicts, but also when it comes to peace settlements, and when it comes to conflict termination. So we can think all the issues that come up and after war, with researchers that have been working in Colombia, in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and hopefully soon in Ukraine. So. And some of these research are trying to develop some sort of tools for educating for peace and to transform. Then I think I'm gonna come to this, to how the system, collective, social, is also entangled to our personal disposition. So to these tools to develop for peace also need to engage the individual. So it requires a personal transformation of our dispositions to peace, to conflict, and also a rather comprehensive conception of peace, which will reach well beyond all the military issues and also encompass what we understand by living in peace on a psychic, affective, moral, political, for some even spiritual level. So I would give a short example. Maybe we can come back later to these questions if you have interest. I would give just a very short example of how the issue of peace in do-it-yourself bio have been framed differently in US and in the European communities. So in the early 2010, dry bio communities, they have made up what they have called the Code of Ethics. So they have about 10 values, values, transparency, open access, education, and so on. And one of these values is called, they have called peaceful purposes. So in the European communities, they have described the peaceful purposes as biotechnology must be used for peaceful purposes. And the North American, they call North American, they are essentially US communities. They, on their side, they have defined it a bit differently. It's slightly different, but it will show you a substantial social cultural change in worldviews. So they have framed peaceful purposes as biotechnology should be used for peaceful purposes. So in the European communities, we see a way more oriented, mandatory, and strong engagement with peaceful purposes, whereas in the North American communities, we see rather an open space, open space for well more voluntary, individual-based attachment to these peaceful purposes. And then we can engage in all the series of issues on how and what can explain these two different instances of people working, essentially trying to tinker with the same stuff and very similar projects. So I think I would stop here for now, and I'll leave the floor for, I don't know who's coming next, or who would have a question, and we can come back later.
Well, thank you very much to both of you, and this was now also very lucid, very clear. Thank you for being here, and I'm glad you were able to join us. So let me just ask one question to start us off with. And I think there is a lot more, and perhaps also from the chat, we'll get a lot more questions. Also, especially also to Sara, to maybe also elucidate a little bit more, to develop a little bit more what you find objectionable to certain practices. But I want to ask a very simple question. And even though I think nothing is really simple today, we are talking about things on a kind of conceptual level. We are not really talking about our practical experiences from tinkering ourselves or anything like that. That would be another discussion. But today we are talking about how to, what's happening, what's going on, what can be done, what do we see? And I started off with this really naive story. Daphne, you didn't hear it. I was talking about ham radio operators and how with their very simple tinkering and constructing and building things together, perhaps a kind of any kind of collective construction work is already a kind of cooperative, peaceful endeavor, right? That's what I said, very, very simply. And I think both of you were saying, it's much more complicated than that. Be careful what you do. And I'm not sure whether I like that message. I want people to be able to do this in a very naive and straightforward way. But what you're saying is you can have very best intentions, but if, for example, your intentions imply that you think that peace and conflict only arises in more or less barbarian situations in some kind of strange corners of the world, and of course civilized people would never engage in peaceful activity, in war-like activities, then of course you're projecting some values, right? And I think that's how I understood you, Sara. Then you're projecting some values which may actually work against, be counterproductive in some ways, and you might even serve someone else's interest and not be aware of it, and so maybe just tell me whether I understood you right. And but wouldn't that be a terrible thing to tell tinkerers and citizen scientists, that you have to kind of be on your toes and watch yourself and don't follow your intuitions?
Indeed. So yes, you got me right, Alfred. You conveyed my critique very accurately. And yes, it would be a sorry state of affairs if the message to be conveyed to peace thinkers or citizen scientists in this space to just hold back, withhold their efforts, but then maybe the message that I want to convey is merely that one should be critical, and that's all I aim with my critique here. That one should just be aware of the conditions and the structures in which their actions ensue, and to some extent also question some of the narratives by Western states around citizen science initiatives, namely that they impart a veneer of that they impart agency to the people, and that they are the best, most manifest expression of democracy, as though this is a good in itself. I would only be a bit wary of these narratives that just entrench the idea that peace is already a good that has been attained in the West, and the West now is to be exempted from responsibility, some measure of responsibility in inflaming some of the conflicts in other parts of the world. So my message is really just to be aware and critical of one's practices.
So, so that would, if I may just continue, and I think we should just start a conversation and everyone should join in. There is no real structure here, but that would suggest to me that that does actually also create a kind of linkage between what is sometimes called citizen science and what's sometimes called sort of tinkering or working in maker spaces, where you can't really divorce them in the sense that it does involve some kind of engagement with things, and engaging with things means trying to find out how they work, try to kind of gain knowledge, and so the question is, how deeply immersed do we need to get into a specific situation, and even to fully understand before we engage. I mean, this might also be true for, and this is now I'm changing sort of gear a little bit for Daphne, because I know that you're also interested in some of the sort of more biological issues, maybe issues about environmental justice, where of course a lot of conflicts arise also about the use of resources, pollution, and so forth, and the power struggles around that, where I think maybe it's the same kind of thing, that the peace kind of engagement, the peace engagement of citizen scientists begins, you might say, with research, with monitoring activities, with exploring the kind of causalities involved, the kind of power structures involved. Would you agree with that? Do you have maybe also other examples of that?
Unfortunately, no, I don't have examples of that. I would just add about, I think, complementing what Sara was saying, the importance of paying attention to the power structures. However, we think we can act and try to change things, and the importance of being aware of the limits, yes, as she was saying. And not only that, how these actions can be co-opted, as she showed, but also on the difference. Well, when we speak of peace, is also about power asymmetries, yeah, and how can we as citizens go beyond such huge power asymmetries in trying to act and to change and try to contribute to solving things, yeah. But I think the question of citizen science and about vigilantism, either environmental or digital vigilantism, and finding alternative ways to bring these findings, yeah, make these findings public. I think it's like, it's not something that there's no way to come to bypass these actions. I don't know if Sara would agree.
I don't, definitely. Thank you for elaborating on my point.
Well, that raises another two questions actually from my point of view. Maybe put one first, kind of again on the naive and romantic stories that I like to tell. So Daphne, you were just talking about power asymmetries. Now, I think that might actually be something that is a special kind of feature of citizen science, that citizen scientists are often especially good at working with those, because I mean, in some sense, not all of citizen science, obviously we can talk about what it is and the different kind of practices that are being subsumed under this term. But one thing that citizen science often does is that's already part of a power asymmetry, right? So people, they have to present information, they have to create knowledge, they have to collect data, often in some sense against, you might say, the standard views. It's perhaps been invisibilized what they do, what they're interested in, and they want to make evidence meaningful, which scientists have maybe considered to be irrelevant, and so on. So already, I think citizen science have to always muster a kind of diligence, you might say. I like this word. German word Sachlichkeit, which means a kind of attunement with things, a kind of turning to things in a very attentive way, because often you don't have maybe the huge data sets that scientists have available to them. So you have to kind of cultivate the data that you do have and make them be careful to make them speak in a way that is credible. So there's already a kind of engagement, you might say, in data production and making things from a point of view of power asymmetry, making things kind of valuable and worthwhile. So maybe it would be a kind of argument to say that citizen scientists are especially well positioned to deal with some of these things.
May I add something?
Mm-hmm.
I agree with this, and I think it's part of what I was trying to express, to convey. And I would add to this that while this is fundamental, and we can probably, most of us agree with the importance, I think there is the risk of focusing on the technical, focusing way too much on the technical evidence of like getting data or images and evidence of all of this, and sort of sometimes like losing the political and democratic process way too like away from this. Like only the evidences and the technicalities would suffice to bring change. And that's what I was trying to make, to convey with the idea of power asymmetries as well, that I probably we need to be aware of this, the need to carry. It's not a short task, a tiny task, but to carry these technical, scientific, and political struggles together. So this evidence can also be heard and have an impact. So that's what I was, I hope it's clear.
Maybe to underscore what you were saying, and I'll turn this into a question to Sara, this focusing on the technical. I mean, I was struck by many of your examples, but especially by the one where you have these cameras tethered to balloons and they kind of hover in the sky and they take pictures of the ground. And you said, well, there are different kind of technological variants of this, and so on. And this is a technology presumably to detect certain things that might be valuable about identification of conflict or distribution of resources and things like that. So all this is well and good, but first of all, it does still have this very technical feature that Daphne was just talking about. I mean, it's mostly about data collection and trusting, you might say, that the data will do the job in the end. But at the same time, it also uses a technology which is a little sort of in line with drones and other kind of things, which are often actually used rather also for military purposes, for surveillance purposes, and that are often perceived as being in some sense disempowering. So that seemed to be a kind of interesting kind of ambivalence, let's say, to use a kind of device that in many ways is a device to propagate violence, you might say, and surveillance and power, to use it supposedly for good ends, but only the ones who actually employ it or deploy it, they know that it's good ends, right? And for other people, it looks like just another surveillance technology from the ground. So this seems to be, again, so I wonder whether they are very different models. And one thing you didn't talk about at all, Sarah, is there any kind of form of this kind of vigilantism or other kind of verificationist work that is actually collaborative, where you might say it's crucial that there are people in different parts of the world working together on this, and maybe even in some of the countries which might be under surveillance. And so I mean, is there kind of reciprocity? Do we have those kinds of consortia that people start to kind of use citizen science to bridge, to work across boundaries and borders?
Yeah, so to your first point on whether cameras tethered to balloons and kites can be compared to drone technology. Now here's the thing, so it would be a bit hasty not to consider the kinds of actors who were involved, and that I did not mention. So it was basically kids blowing the balloons, building their kites, and then tethering cameras to them and flying those. And from their perspective, Palestinian kids, from their perspective, these are just, well, fun elements that can fly below the radar and not look as threatening as, well, the kind of very complex aerial surveillance technology that is used by the Israelis. So much for that point. Now, for the second point, digital vigilantism, has it ever taken a more collaborative form that works across borders, across communities? I think this speaks very well to your point on, well, best intentions, and that's all we have. And indeed, when this movement of using free and commercial satellite technology in the context of weapons of mass destruction, detection, verification, when that was up and coming in just the last 5 years, let's say, some NGOs, and here I'm talking about professional communities, in the space got together and thought, okay, how about we actually educate the citizens on how to work with commercial and free satellite imagery, how to what to look out for in this imagery, and how to annotate it in order to build a database of locations that look a bit suspicious from a Western perspective, that could be tagged as a proliferation risk for weapons of mass destruction. Lo and behold, the way this was set up was, okay, let's be open, let's try to get everyone on board. It doesn't just need to be Americans or Westerners, it can be just anyone and everyone. And they did indeed try to do an outreach to get as many people from different nationalities, from different countries, from different institutions on board. But there were apparently limitations, not the least because maybe some actors fear for their own security to join such initiatives. So even if we solve the technological barrier problem, there are other concerns to take into consideration, like, for instance, the fear of certain individuals to partake in these activities. So asymmetries happen even there on this level. And then in response to such attitudes, you find the communities as situated in the West thinking, okay, well, there's an ethical dimension to that. We should not involve these actors from outside of the West, lest their security would be compromised. So it's all a game of best intentions indeed, but then the asymmetries just continue to accumulate in this manner due to political and structural reasons, of course.
I am afraid our time is actually kind of up, I think, and actually some of our participants have been telling us that. So we have to draw this to a close, but I hope it's going to be a temporary close and that we maybe find a way in a few months or whatever at some point to continue this discussion, and maybe also bring in some more of those people who are actually in different kind of makerspace type situations, actually doing these kinds of things. In the meantime, I kind of end up on a also kind of positive note for my kind of romantic idealization. You've just provided some more fodder, Sarah, by saying, by telling the story about the Palestinian children with their balloons, being able to do something that is actually, because it is balloons and because it is children and because it is so simple in some sense, and it's not a political gesture as such, because of that, it actually manages to do some things that sort of counteract sort of, or looks at least very different and appears different in the mode of work and the mode of knowledge production than a kind of drone that flies across the territory and takes stock. So maybe these kinds of also collaborative schemes that you just mentioned, which are of course risky if you are involved in really political games, you might say, can also have that sort of more playful dimension. So maybe we could do already some work for peace if we get people to just play together. And I'm sure some of that is happening already, that you can use, of course, video technology and video game technology probably to get people from different countries and even warring countries, conflicting countries to engage in just a kind of fun sort of activity together, creating something together, which at least holds the promise that there is another life beyond conflict and strife and war. But I'll stop here with a little last kind of sermon and give the word back to Beatrice, our hostess.
I really want to thank you all, Daphne, Alfred, and Sara. It was extremely interesting, and I agree with Alfred that this is something that we can continue, because I'm sure that people that watch this today and people that will watch it, because it's going to be on YouTube, I think this week, will be really excited to hear more about it. So again, thank you very much, and thank you to all the participants that were here. And I want to remind you that there will be a conference in Berlin, the EXA conference in autumn, and the main topic is planetary health, and that is actually, sorry, okay, that's actually very related to this, because I mean, you also mentioned it, this is in the planetary level, so peace is definitely something that we can relate in terms of planetary health. I'm gonna post the link in the chat. And other than that, I think
did already, yes.
You did already, perfect. Then I think we can close right now, and just again, thank you everyone for your interesting discussions.